the attention of the House to my register of interest, where I serve to this day as a councillor, and the other in Hackney. But the circumstances today could not be more different. Although, Madam Deputy Speaker, it may have the eventual similarity of the need for a new Conservative administration to take office in Croydon to sort out the mess, a challenge which I know Councillor Jason Cummings and his opposition colleagues will rise to, and a challenge which was very familiar to us in Hillingdon. Now, Section 114 notice starts off as a sign of cash flow distress in a council. Income is insufficient for planned expenditure, so services have to be cut and expenditure halted until the budget is balanced again. We know it has no direct private sector equivalent, but it has the effect of requiring the organisation's management to demonstrate that it is a going concern. And today, with councillors and residents across the city seeing what is happening in Croydon with worry, it is important that we address the issues that have led to this situation here in Parliament. And given the unfortunate silence of some of the Labour members representing them, this debate has the purpose of airing those financial challenges facing our London boroughs and providing some assurance to my constituents and others across our capital that the situation in Croydon is not replicated elsewhere. Now, local government financial management, Madam Deputy Speaker, is a complex, some would say dull, but in many respects unique process. It's unique in the public sector in that councils have to balance their budgets every year, and clearly constituents across the capital will want to know that there is effective governance and oversight of decision-making in place. And the consequences can be very serious. In Hillingdon, we faced a 14.8% council tax rise, tens of millions of pounds of unspecified cuts, a budget that had only been legal for the duration of the meeting at which it was agreed, as a legacy from a previous administration. And clearly, residents in Croydon will want to know, as do people across the capital, that they have an assurance that that is not a fate which might await them. Now, context, of course, is all important here. Our councillors and constituents also want to know that they can see the evidence that what's happened there is unique. And further work is underway, I'm aware, from the department and those in the wider local government sector to establish the detail of what's been happening to date. But there are certain things strikingly different about the situation facing Croydon, which should give some assurance to residents in my constituency and elsewhere as a whole. So firstly, looking at the picture across London, the House may wish to note the finance report to the London Council's Leaders Committee of the 8th of December, which noted an overall rise of 4.5% in local authority resource available as a result of the spending review. And the House may also wish to note the commentary in that same report, which highlights the additional resources from government to ameliorate the financial impact that COVID has had on London's councils. And whilst this does leave an estimated funding gap in the next financial year, the broad picture from across London and the feedback from my own local authorities is that the COVID measures provided by the Ministry have met the costs of COVID in terms of service delivery. And we all recognise that councils have done an amazing job in the capital of rising to that challenge. So what this adds up to, Madam Deputy Speaker, is a picture whereby that serious impact of COVID on the capital's finances has been substantially mitigated to the extent that council's financial resilience should not be compromised. So given this background, it is clear that the situation in Croydon is not a consequence of COVID. So is it a consequence of austerity? Well, council budgets consist of a number of elements, some of which are ring-fenced, such as the dedicated schools grant, the housing revenue account, parking revenue account, public health grant. The main part of the budget which is visible to residents, the general fund, is largely spent on the day-to-day statutory services of the authority, the bulk of that on social care, but also on very, very resident visible services such as parks, libraries, waste collection, clearing up litter. And that general fund also services any debt finance costs relating to general fund capital expenditure. And the good practice and the expectation of auditors is that councils will retain a reserve, known in local authority accounting terms as balances, sufficient to cover the likely risks in that budget. And this is where we begin to see a divergence from the practice of our other London councils. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, financial risk is a part of life for councils, and planning for it is a characteristic of all soundly financially managed authorities. Hillingdon, for example, faced the COVID crisis with around £54 million in balances and reserves, sufficient to cover pretty much any financial challenge which would come the way of the authority, and ensuring that residents would see stable delivery of services, that libraries, that litter and waste collection, potholes being filled, would all carry on, come what may. And Harrow Council, which also serves my constituents, is more financially challenged, but in my regular briefings from their Chief Executive and Finance team, it is clear that it remains on course for a stable and balanced budget. So we need to ask the question, where do we see a variance? Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, Council's involvement in housing development is, in my view, an absolutely essential part of housing delivery in the capital. And it's welcome that council taxpayers, rather than developers, will see the upside of the gain where developments take place. But it is noteworthy in the case of Croydon that unusually the local authority has loaned a housing subsidiary around £220 million of capital, borrowed money, of which a total of zero has been returned against a reported business plan to have returned £110 million by today. Now, clearly, this knocks a very significant hole in their budgetary position. But having gone into the COVID crisis with a capital debt of £1.5 billion, by far the highest in London, it is clear that whilst the capital borrowing to invest in assets and services is no bad thing, it does impose borrowing costs on council taxpayers, in this case around £43 million each year, and that is compounded if those business plans go wrong. And using those resources to fund what has essentially been, since 27, it appears, a burst of speculative property investments, it's clear that the diversion of resources into servicing debts which are not generating their planned returns on this scale was a very significant part of the problem and created a very weak financial position going into the outbreak of COVID.
Well, now we give way.
Of course.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm very grateful to the honourable member for giving way. The financial situation in Croydon is worrying to residents in Carshalton and Wallington, as the London Borough of Sutton sits directly next to the London Borough of Croydon. He mentioned there the council's housing development arm. Does he share my concern that the huge amount of money that has been wasted here has not been something that the council administration seems to be accepting itself, and that the first step to recovery for Croydon is going to have to be that the administration acknowledging the mistakes that were made to get them to this point?
Madam Deputy Speaker, my honourable friend, the member for Carshalton and Wallington, is absolutely right to draw attention to this. And part of the reason for this debate is the frustration expressed by many that everyone from the auditors to local residents to councillors in the opposition group to members of Parliament were raising these concerns, but they seem to have fallen on deaf ears. And the need for that assurance in other local authorities, not just Hillingdon and Harrow, but Sutton and elsewhere, that there is a closer degree of attention being paid to the finances is absolutely critical. And the point which my honourable friend for Carshalton and Wallington draws attention to was compounded in the case of Croydon, when, as Grant Thornton, the auditors, highlighted, there was a growing and unaddressed funding gap in the delivery of day-to-day services. These are the basics of the knitting for a local authority, as opposed to extraordinary speculative business activity which is out of the norm. And it prompted Grant Thornton to issue an extraordinary step, a report in the public interest, given the scale of their concerns, highlighting a shortfall of around £60 million between the resources available and the budgeted expenditure. And that is a cash flow problem on a massive scale, distinctly out of proportion with anything that we see in any other London borough. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, I should declare I enjoyed a positive working relationship with the former Croydon leader, Councillor Tony Newman, in my local government days. and always found him a very passionate advocate for Croydon, somewhere that was clearly his place, that he felt determined to improve. And there is no suggestion that he or his colleagues have acted in anything other than good faith. But with such a perilous financial position facing residents, and others across London asking what this means for them, it clearly is important that the department, that the government, the wider local government family and Croydon themselves are clear both about what has gone wrong and that this combination of failed commercial property speculation and, more importantly, the failure to address the fundamental management issues is out of step with what we see in other London boroughs. And I want all residents in the capital to enjoy the stability, the residents-first attitude, the sound financial management, which is consistently highlighted by my constituents in Hillingdon, because it is critical to the delivery of services on which our community depends. So, drawing to a close, Madam Deputy Speaker, it's very clear that Hillingdon and Harrow, Barking and Bexley, Havering, Redbridge have all faced the financial challenges of austerity and of COVID, and they have emerged with budgets that are robust. And it is what some have described as disastrous failed commercial property speculation and a fundamental lack of grip on the finances that have unusually brought Croydon to this position. And the local government sector is stepping in to help, and I know ministers will be aware of the particular value of the local government association-led, sector-led improvement teams who are already beginning to help out. After all, why pay expensive consultancy firms when peers who've been through it are able to rally round and use their experience to help sort the situation out? But whilst their Labour representatives have sadly remained silent on these concerns, and in the case of Mayor Khan, heaped praise on that administration for, and I quote, perfect examples of projects that even then were millions over budget, I am determined, and we should be determined, to provide other residents across London with an assurance that such failings are not common across London's councils, and I know ministers are equally determined that the success of our councils is not undermined by the reputational damage from what's happened in Croydon.
Minister Kelly Tolhurst.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I am grateful to the Honourable Member for Russellett, Northwood and Pinner for securing this debate on such an important topic, and I am pleased to respond on behalf of the Government. I thank my honourable friend for highlighting his experience as a serving councillor in London. I also agree that the mismanagement by the Labour-run Croydon Council leading to the Section 114 notices damages the reputation of the excellent work that is carried out by local authorities up and down the country.